Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, October 13th, 2025, and just a few days ago, we saw Amy McGrath from the state of Kentucky announce her bid for United States Senate in the 2026 midterm elections. If her name rings a bell, it's because it should. In the 2020 election, she ran against then Senator Mitch McConnell. He's still in the United States Senate when he ran for his final term in the 2020 presidential election year. And she had received a lot of attention because in 2018, she took a race that was arguably not competitive and made it extremely competitive in Kentucky's 6th congressional district against Representative Andy Barr, who still stays in Congress today, when his district went from being Republican plus 22 all the way down to being a district that he won by just 3.5 points. 2 years later, he would revert it back into being a very solid district for the GOP, but Amy McGrath's overperformance put her on the radar in the state of Kentucky. And in 2020, she decided ultimately that she was going to run for Senate in that year. A lot of people had wide speculation that if Donald Trump was to collapse in 2020 amidst the pandemic and all other factors that were part of this, that some of these seats that might otherwise seem entirely out of reach would suddenly become in reach as Republicans reached a record low in popularity, and these Republican incumbents likewise did as well. Mitch McConnell had a record low approval rating, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Republicans across Kansas, Steve Daines in Montana, and it opened up the opportunity for Democrats to really invest in many of these races in expectation that this overperformance, for instance, that we saw in 2018, would translate into a massive overperformance in the Senate election in 2020. But what we learned very quickly, and what I think many Democrats and Republicans came to realize, was that depending on how a state voted on the presidential level, it just simply wasn't going to change dramatically enough on a Senate level, no matter who was running on either side of the aisle. In 2020, Donald Trump won the state of Kentucky by 25.9%, a pretty impressive margin coming off 2016 when he won by 29.8%. It was still a very solid victory, and Democrats had absolutely no reason to believe that on the presidential level, Kentucky might swing. But on the Senate level, they were far more hopeful, not just because of the candidate they were running, but because they were running against Mitch McConnell, who was the most unpopular he had ever been in Kentucky history in 2020. And yet, Mitch McConnell won his re-election by roughly 19 points. In fact, based on election history, this was the second worst performance for a Democrat in Kentucky against Mitch McConnell. And get this, Democrats invested over $100 million in this race. When you take a look at the open secrets race from 2020, you will find that in the 2020 election cycle, Kentucky was one of the most expensive races of the cycle. In the top 5, 2 of the races went to Republicans by double digits. Georgia and Georgia special election, it makes sense that so much money was invested in the race. In Arizona, it makes sense. In Maine, it made sense. In Michigan, it made sense. In Iowa, even in Montana, where Democrats ended up coming up short, it was $82 million in contrast, and that's on both sides spending, to $166 million spent on both sides of the aisle, with it disproportionately being on the Democratic side when Amy McGrath raised $94 million in Kentucky, only to outrun Joe Biden by 6 points across the state. For context, the Biden-Harris team in 2020 spent no money in Kentucky in 2020. Less than $100,000 was spent in this state when it came down to investments for the presidential ticket, and there was a reason for that, because they knew the election was far gone in Kentucky. Now, obviously, in 2020, there was a lot more speculation about other races, too. In South Carolina, Democrats had invested over $100 million as well. Jamie Harrison raised $130 million to lose this race. Not to say that he didn't narrow it up. Sure, it was closer than it was in the presidential, but in either case, Kentucky or South Carolina, Democrats lost these races. And I think that they learned a bit, at least through 2022 and 2024, that they had started investing less in races that were entirely unwinnable. They learned that in the 2020 cycle, no matter how much money you throw at the race, that some of these races just simply won't budge. Now, Democrats fell for the trap in Florida in 2022. We talked about this a bit. The expectations there were that Republicans were going to win that Senate race pretty easily, and they won it by 19 points, might I add, after Democrats had spent in 2022 $79 million in Florida, a state Obama won twice, to lose the race by 19 points. Massive margin for the GOP, but the rest of the races made sense. Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Ohio, Wisconsin, Nevada, North Carolina, all of these races were extremely competitive, at least at one point in time in the race when the money made sense. J.D. Vance was largely saved by Mitch McConnell, But besides that, the rest of these races were competitive through Election Day, and even Ohio was narrower than it was in any of the 3 elections that Donald Trump had won Ohio in. And even in 2024, we saw less and less of this massive spending. Texas saw it, but Colin Alred did outrun, not Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris by a margin of roughly 6.5 points, actually slightly underperformed, outperformed Hillary Clinton as well by roughly half a point. But Ted Cruz also was terrified about this race. He spent, $105 million outspent Colin Alred in the race. In Ohio, Sherrod Brown outran Kamala Harris by 7 under better circumstances on the presidential level. He might be a senator today. Montana had an incumbent Democrat, so it made sense here. In Maryland, right? Former Republican Governor Larry Hogan was running in this race, and Republicans, likewise to Democrats, were also investing in Maryland. So for some of these races, California was an expensive multi-way primary, a lot to look at there. But my take here, really, is that Democrats learned a valuable lesson in 2020. That investing in these losing races, because it is Democrats who constantly outflank and outpace Republicans on fundraising dollars, and oftentimes it does translate to victories, right? Without the amount of money raised in 22, Democrats would not have won control of the U.S. Senate in 24. They would not have held on to as many seats as they did. So money does talk in politics 1,000%. But it doesn't move mountains in the way that I think that some Democrats, or even some, not even Democrats, because I think a lot of people have woken up to the very real reality of electoral politics. That is, a lot of these states just simply won't budge. But I think that in 2026, with this most recent announcement that, Amy McGrath is deciding to run for Senate again, Democrats need to be very cautious about where they invest their money in 2026, because it is not as simple as, a dollar here is going to help any Democrats down ballot. Kentucky is safe red no matter where you look. The districts have been drawn in a way that are so exceptionally Republican that there is no shot Democrats come even close to victory in any one of these districts. Even if you're shifting the margin here in the last election by 15 points to the left, they're all still safe seats, save one. Shifted another 15 points, and you only flip one seat. That is a 30-point shift across the state, and the surrounding districts are still safe for the GOP. For context, if that was to translate on a House level in 2024, the map would look like this. Double it up, Democrats would have 333 seats in the House, and yet Kentucky would still only have one more seat from the Democratic Party. And every other seat would still be safe red. There is no electoral benefit of a narrower Senate election in Kentucky in 2026. This election in 26 is going to be very solid for the GOP because Mitch McConnell is retiring. This is going to be a race where Republicans have a wide field, but Andy Barr is probably going to get it. It could be Daniel Cameron. We'll see. But looking at the election, we'll see who ends up winning the nomination. The point is that whoever wins this nomination will, in fact, win the general election. Because in 2020, the pundits, too, fell for this idea that it might be more narrow than it was going to be. Likely was, equally rated as much as safe. But today, it's safe for the GOP in every regard. And I think that, some Democrats, too, have looked at Kentucky and said, okay, well, if Governor Beshear, if Andy Beshear can win Kentucky, doesn't that mean Democrats have a fighting chance? No. To be very real with you, no. Because Senate elections are dramatically different than governor elections. A lot of voters are willing to elect Republican governors in blue states and Democratic governors in red states because they know that the extent at which the power is given to the governor ends on the state boundary level. There are no national implications besides maybe propping up a future presidential bid of electing a blue governor in a red state or a red governor in a blue state. But on the Senate level, it determines everything. Balance of power, Senate majority leader, bills that pass to the president's desk. It matters to a higher degree, which is why you will find, great example, is in 2016. When in the 2016 election, what happened in Montana was that Donald Trump won the state by 21 points. But do you want to know what coincided in Montana in 2016 in that state? A governor's election, where Democrat Steve Bullock won by 5 points against now a sitting U.S. Representative Greg Gianforte in this race. Unless he's governor now. He's governor now. But he ran for Congress in 2017 in the special election. There was a report that he had body slammed a reporter, still ended up winning. But the point is that in 2016, Steve Bullock won by 5 points because even though it was a presidential election, voters liked Steve Bullock. He was elected in 2012, again on the same ballot that Mitt Romney was winning in Montana in 2012, and he won re-election when Donald Trump did. But the reason I think he's a great example is not just the governor level, but because 4 years later, the same election that Amy McGrath raised $100 million in to spend in Kentucky that went on to lose by 19 points, is that he also ran a campaign in 2020, but this time for Senate. And despite winning under Mitt Romney and Donald Trump, when Donald Trump did better in Montana in 2016 than he did in 2020, Steve Bullock ran against an unpopular Republican Senator, Steve Daines. Steve Bullock, popularity was high, 100% name ID, a lot of investments from the National Democratic Party, and yet, because the circumstances of the race surrounded a more nationalized picture, voters rejected him by 10 points. By 10 points. It wasn't even particularly close. So when I think about 2026, while Andy Beshear might have won Kentucky in 23, they are entirely separate ball games. There have been countless examples, even my home state of Maryland, Larry Hogan, who was governor for 8 years, survived in 2018, not just by a little, but won by double digits in a blue wave year in one of the bluest states in the nation because he was popular. Voters liked him, and they thought he was a good governor. And even though he was a Republican, they were willing to look past that because there were no national implications. But 6 years later, decided to run for Senate against Angela Alsobrooks and lost by double digits. His approval rating is in the high 60s. And yet, when he ran against Angela Alsobrooks in 2024, 6 years later, he lost. And so when you think about Amy McGrath, my honest answer here is that no, I do not think she's going to be the next U.S. Senator from Kentucky. And I don't think she's even going to come close. Regardless if it's Daniel Cameron, who lost the governor's race, or Andy Barr, who still won against her in 2018 under, a better and more favorable environment for Democrats on the national level and a, bluer district than Kentucky was red. This seat is going to the GOP no matter how much money Democrats throw at it, which means they should not throw a penny at it. There are no down ballot effects of it benefiting it on the House level. The most you could see is a state legislative bump, and even then, Amy McGrath on her own accord, with the name ID that she has and with the candidacy that she has from 2020, will already help with that. But in terms of investing $10, $20, $30 million, the 2026 elections are going to be one of the most important ones of the cycle. And God forbid for the Democratic Party, they lose a race by the narrowest of margins the same way they did in 2024, like in a state. For instance, a great example is Pennsylvania, when we saw that Dave McCormick defeated Bob Casey by 0.2%. Not saying that money would have changed this race dramatically, but maybe 10 to 20 million more could have shifted the margins. This was 15,000 voters that needed to be persuaded out of roughly 6.5 million that had cast their ballot in Pennsylvania. So I do believe the idea that to some degree, when you misspend your money and when you spend it in races that are entirely unwinnable, when that money could be going elsewhere and could be invested in bluer states, in winnable states, in swing states, Democrats missed that mark, and they did so tremendously in 2020. Tremendously in 2020. And when you think about 2026, it would be very bad for them to make the same mistake and do the same exact thing. The good news for Democrats is that they've already started raising a lot of money in races that they know are winnable. In North Carolina, Governor Roy Cooper, the former Democratic governor, has already broken fundraising record after fundraising record in the state. In Texas, James Tallarico, in 3 weeks of his campaign, is raising fundraising records and breaking them in this state as well. What we're finding is that Democrats are seeing, a competitive primary in Maine, which will be helpful. Money being raised in Michigan on both sides. We'll see, because these races are going to be the more important ones. These races are going to be the more winnable races. But Kentucky absolutely will not be that case. Alabama, which has a retiring incumbent, I've seen some speculation that, Doug Jones won it in 2017, but then he lost it in 2020. Not by a little, but by nearly 20 points. Alabama, Kentucky are without reach. They are not within reach for the Democrats. Florida is not within reach for the Democrats. Montana is not within reach for the Democrats in 24. They should not be investing in these races to the way that they did in 2020. And while I do think that many Democrats have absolutely learned their lesson, I do think that it would be something that I would not be shocked to see if history repeated itself and there was investments and time being put into races that I am telling you today that we will know and find to be true on Election Day are entirely unwinnable. Because I am always of the opinion that these districts here that are more narrow, where investments can make a big difference, where change in turnout can make a big difference, in statewide races On the Senate level, they simply will not. And that's the exact reason why many of these races, both left and right, because of their partisanship, and because we are not in the day and age where maybe there could have been a Democratic senator from Kentucky like there was, decades ago. We are not in that day and age of politics where polarization has not taken full hold on everyday American politics. But today, and as it stands right now, that is the case. And looking at 2026, looking at 2028, it's going to be the same deal. So if there's any real takeaway that you should take away from this video, is that Amy McGrath running for Senate in Kentucky is good for Democrats, but they should not be investing in this race. And it stands to be one of many that we've already started to see where there is, yes, a lot of hype and a lot of speculation and a lot of, questioning about these races. Is this something worth getting involved in? Is this something that is worth investing in? My honest answer right now is that at least as it stands to this race, and we'll talk about them as they arise, the answer is probably not. And thinking about 2026, there will be far more important and competitive races that we will see really honed in on for the 2026 midterms. But Kentucky, unfortunately, for Democrats in that state and Amy McGrath, just simply is not one of them. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.